Hi, it's John Waterman. I'm from Carbondale, Colorado.
John Waterman is an author and climber who spent many seasons climbing and writing about Denali.
Well, I was first introduced to Denali in 1976 when I went with my Boy Scout troop to Denali. And then I returned once more in 81 to guide and to climb the mountain with a friend on two different trips. And the following year, 82, was when I worked as a ranger, 82, 83, and 84. So it was a very brief tenure.
John's time on Denali and in the surrounding landscape of Denali National Park affected him deeply. The characters he encountered, the rescues he was a part of, and the life-changing experiences up high on the mountain would inspire him to write a series of books, Surviving Denali, In the Shadow of Denali, and perhaps his most classic work, High Alaska. This book, which is a comprehensive historical mountaineering guide to Denali, Foraker, and Hunter, has been a coveted handbook to aspiring Alaska Range climbers for over 35 years.
And it was a massive project because that was in the late 1980s, after I quit the Park Service. And, the internet didn't exist yet. So I had to write letters or make phone calls to all those climbers. I wanted to contact everyone who had done a first ascent on Denali, Foraker, and Hunter. I spent an enormous amount of time. It was an obsessive, compulsive task to track down everyone. Yeah. And one of the great pleasures of that book was also working with Brad Washburn, whom I connected with years before because I grew up in Boston. And he was always a generous guy, and he opened his files to me. And in many cases, that allowed me to connect with these climbers from years, decades past in many cases. More importantly, he gratis provided the photographs. And that's, I think, why that book is so treasured.
John's right. The book is treasured. In fact, when he returned to Denali in 2016 as a volunteer ranger, he actually encountered climbers who were still carrying the book on the mountain.
I'm honored that it's still out there because Fred Beckey did a really good guidebook to the mountain as well. And Fred was a very intelligent, highly intelligent guy, and he wrote really well in that book about geology and formation of the mountain, and he wrote well about the routes. But he didn't have the Washburn photographs, I guess. I don't think that Fred was entirely interested in the character sketches as much as I was, too. I mean, I'm a writer by profession. Fred was a really good writer, but he was a dirtbag by profession.
Yeah. So, John, when you really get down to the nitty-gritty of it, why did you write High Alaska?
I did that project because I really believe that most climbers lacked the sense of history behind the early ascents, and that by understanding the history and the people, that people would have a richer understanding and respect for the mountain.
Denali is a mountain with a rich climbing history. Its routes are coveted by climbers around the world. But for John, a few milestones stand head and shoulders above the others.
Of course, the first ascents were the milestones. 1913, Hudson Stuck and Company, arguably the Sourdoughs 3 years before that, when they did their alpine-style ascent, may have been a bigger milestone because they did it so quickly with what are now modern techniques. But we don't know that they actually made it to the summit. And even if they did make it to the summit, they made it to the North Summit. So, Brad Washburn's work on the West Buttress was a milestone because he opened up the mountain to climbers. And that's important. And he's such a figurehead, not only because of his opening up the West Buttress, but because of his photographs and his advocacy of, new route establishment throughout the range. So you can't talk about milestones on Denali without talking about the West Buttress opening in the 50s and Brad Washburn's role in the game. And then the Winter Ascent in 1967 by Art Davidson and Ray Genet and Dave Johnston was huge and sort of paved the way for people to really stretch their limits.
But from a technical standpoint and perhaps a perspective of aesthetics and purity, one line stands head and shoulders above the rest.
There are periods where amazing things were accomplished. One of the great milestones that jumps out is the Riccardo Cassin's ascent of what is now known as the Cassin Ridge.
This season, we're going back in time to unlock the history of some of North America's most iconic mountains and routes. Over the years, the mountains of North America have captivated climbers around the world, leading them to the wild arenas of the Canadian Rockies, the North Cascades, the Tetons, the Alaska Range. Their stories are etched on these high alpine walls. Their visions follow lines of cold gray ice. What inspires them? What makes them come back? Who survives? Who suffers? These are the stories that we'll tell on Season 6 of the Firn Line. This is the Cassin Ridge. All right, how would you describe the Cassin to someone who's maybe never seen it?
Well, the principal thing is its directness.
It's kind of a quintessential alpine challenge.
Visually and aesthetically, I think it's a very striking line. This very obvious south ridge that goes straight to the summit.
It's an incredible combination of all the qualities you could really ask for or look for in an alpine route.
6,000 feet of technical climbing.
High altitude, 6,000 meters.
Beautiful granite rock.
There's technical climbing on it that is, not impossibly hard, but at the same time, it keeps you very honest.
The route, of course, appears in Steckenroper's 50 Classic Climbs.
The Cassin Ridge is the obvious ridge that splits the south side of Denali right in the middle and hits the summit ridge extremely close to the actual summit of the mountain.
If you're a budding, elite, or even armchair mountaineer, chances are you've heard of the Cassin Ridge on Denali. The route, which was first climbed in 1961 by a large Italian expedition, is the epitome of a classic Alaskan alpine climb. Thousands of feet of moderate to hard alpine ice, knife edge and corniced ridges, mixed rock and ice pitches, and thousands of feet of snow climbing to a 6,000 meter summit. The route is also guarded by a daunting approach through an accordion of bottomless crevasses, and the line is committing as it gets the brunt of south central Alaska's coastal storms. There's a reason it has an esteemed place in Steckenroper's 50 Classic Climbs of North America. When the line was first climbed, it really raised the standard of what was being done in Alaska.
Well, I don't know a ton about the first ascent.
This is Colin Haley, one of the world's best-known alpinists.
I mean, I know that it was a very large Italian expedition, obviously led by Riccardo Cassin.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, is the same person who is responsible for the first ascent of the Walker Spur on the Grand Jaurès and the first ascent of the north face of Piet's Badile. And between those two and the Cassin Ridge, that's a pretty nice resume to have, I'd say.
Well, back then, in 1961, there was a huge sense of the unknown.
In the 1960s, a shift was starting to take place. Climbers from Europe and around the world were beginning to apply tactics from the Dolomites and the Alps to the greater ranges of the Himalaya and Alaska. An Italian climber named Riccardo Cassin was at the cutting edge of this movement. Here's North American alpinist Shantel Stora.
Well, Riccardo Cassin was really good at picking out these striking lines and making them happen. So it's not surprising that he managed to score the first ascent of the Cassin.
Riccardo Cassin and company were steered there by Brad Washburn, who had sent Riccardo the photograph of the route and suggested it because he had an intuition and an eye for what would make a good climbing route. And Riccardo, coming from the Dolomites, knew all about the plumb line, the direct routes, so he was drawn to it like a fly to honey. And, it was the classic early 1960s epic.
He was leading a team of Italian climbers.
Here's Nick Sweeney, an alpinist from the Pacific Northwest, who you heard from in last month's episode, Land of the Forbidden.
They spent some crazy amount of time just sieging this route.
Oh, they spent a month on the mountain with fixed ropes and going up and down and dealing with the weather. They were astonished by the weather. They just didn't think it would be that cold. They weren't really prepared for that kind of cold.
They had super light boots and equipment because they were equipped for, temperatures that they were used to in the Alps. And then you come to Denali, one of the most notoriously cold mountains on Earth, and they were suffering up there for sure.
So they came away with a lot of frostbite. Even with some of the best climbers from Italy of the day, including Riccardo, they were pushed to their limits.
But they sieged their way to the top, and Cassin, rallied his troops. He talked about them as his boys throughout the trip, and he kept the boys going.
So the climb had that nice sort of epic appeal that appeals to all climbers, that one of the best climbers in the world and in the day was so challenged by it.
When Riccardo and his team made the first ascent of the Cassin, it was by far the most difficult line on Denali. Over the years, more climbers would come to the mountain, repeating the Cassin and establishing other routes. And then a climber named Charlie Porter showed up in 1976 and shocked the climbing world.
He did the first solo ascent of the route, and not only was that already, fairly groundbreaking at the time, but he did it extremely fast for the period. I think his solo was in 1976, if I remember correctly. And if I remember correctly, I think he took roughly 36 hours from the Bergschrund to the summit.
Yeah.
Which is kind of even, that would be considered a relatively fast time even today. And this was in a different era when people didn't go climb the West Buttress for 3 weeks to acclimatize beforehand. And to me, it's special because he clearly had a totally different paradigm in his mind about what he could do in the Alaska Range than everyone else did. Keep in mind, the year before the first ascent of the Infinite Spur and the Kennedy Low on Bagaya, and there was definitely no one else in that era just thinking about soloing the Cassin in 36 hours.
That was yet another step into the unknown, climbing it alone as he did. He was a big wall climber, so he was not particularly challenged by the route, but it was a very, very bold thing to do in 1976 when most people, like myself, I was there when he did it. We were just slogging up the West Buttress back in those days. So it was a very far-sighted, brazen thing for him to do in 1976. People are still in awe of that.
John, are there any more benchmarks on the Cassin Ridge that stand out to you?
Well, I would have to say, speaking from my own perspective, that my own winter climb in 1982 was another benchmark.
In February of 1982, John and his partners, Michael Young and Roger Muir, made a daunting ascent of the Cassin in brutal conditions. The trio endured Arctic temperatures, staving off frostbite and dealing with altitude sickness before topping out and then making their way down the West Buttress.
We were lucky to get away with our lives. I suppose that if we'd done it fast, it would have been foolish to have tried to do it fast because that means we wouldn't have had enough food or gear if we were caught by a storm. But, most people that go on the mountain in the wintertime, they go prepared to dig in and survive the storms and the bad weather that invariably comes. during a winter ascent. So we were tremendously lucky with the weather, and even having relatively good weather, despite 50 below or more, along with some wind, we didn't get away unscathed. Two of us had frostbite, and one of us had a very bad fall in a crevasse. So we were out there. It was the most dangerous thing I've ever done in my life.
As the 1980s transitioned into the 90s, a new wave of climbers emerged. Technical climbing was advancing with the modernization of knowledge, training, and gear, and more alpinists embraced the ethos of light and fast. This was a style of climbing that resonated with a North American alpinist named Muggs Stump.
So Charlie Porter had, climbed the Cassin in a slower style, but still incredibly impressive. And then in the early 90s, Muggs Stump decided to do a 14 camp on the West Buttress to 14 camp ascent of the Cassin. So just to leave and keep moving until he returned. And I believe he did that in 36 hours. He didn't go to the true summit of Denali on that ascent. He went to the junction of the Cassin and the West Buttress and descended, but still an incredible climb nonetheless.
And as Shantel notes, there were other milestones to come on the Cassin.
I do know that it was first climbed by women, by Sue Knott and Karen McNeil in the year 2000. And there might have been a female before them, or certainly women after, but I know that they were the first two females to climb it together. Yeah, that's about what I know of the history of it.
In the 2000s, climbing on Denali continued to be popular, with hundreds of climbers from around the world making the pilgrimage each season, usually to attempt the West Buttress. But it was the climbs on the south face that drew the world's elite alpinists, with speedier and speedier ascents each season. And the Cassin was part of that push, as it became a route that was accessible to a broader range of climbers. It also was a testing ground for solo and speed climbers, and we'll get to that and more after the break. So Nick, in my mind, it seems like the Cassin has been one of those routes that's been important for the progression of hard alpine climbing in the last 30 or 40 years. Could you maybe talk about why you think that is?
Yeah, wow, big question. I think, with progressing alpine climbing, there's multiple ways to do it. Some people do it in ways that I personally don't find that exciting, like making things more dangerous, being willing to climb the hardest, most threatened routes. That doesn't get me going. But a route like this, I'm sure was looked at as a test piece at the time, because it was definitely the hardest route climbed on Denali on that date. I mean, there's still to this day, most modern climbers would consider the climbing on the Cassin Ridge to be hard enough where you're working hard. Soloing this kind of route, you're not taking any of these pitches for granted at all. It's very serious terrain. And I think the progression over time with this specific route has gone from a team of, the 10 strongest climbers on Earth coming to do the first ascent, and subsequent teams like the Japanese, still large teams that, were giving their all. These are, by some measure, professional climbers. Whereas, fast forward to when we did it in 2022, me and my friends were basically working stiffs that, had a dream and some gear. And I think that's kind of telling that the everyman climber can go and face up against this kind of challenge. And so I think that juxtaposition of, me being definitely not a professional climber in any way versus what it took to do the first ascent, you can see the rise in standards just based on that.
The Cassin makes for a good discussion about what makes a classic route. I mean, we've already touched on a few reasons why the Cassin is so admired and so sought after, but one thing you can't really wrap your mind around unless you've actually been there is just the sheer scale of it. And then combine all the different types of climbing and adventure you'll find on the route. It really is an all-around experience.
So the south side of Denali is like this broad face, basically. It's got its true south face and then the southwest face, and it's sort of a slight transition from one face to the other. It's not like it's just like a huge, distinct ridge line. And right in the middle of the two faces is basically this rib, a ridge rib that separates the two, with approximately like 6,000 feet of technical climbing.
I will say that the original Cassin Ridge route was quite a bit more technically difficult than the way that it's climbed today, because the original Cassin route followed the crest of the ridge from the bottom and had a bunch of difficult rock climbing. The way that the route is climbed by more than 90% of ascents since many decades starts via the Japanese couloir, which is technically a variation of the Cassin route. But assuming you start by the Japanese couloir, you start with this ice couloir, which is mostly kind of easy, like 50 to 60 degree ice slopes with one pitch of grade 4 ice in the middle of it. At the top of the Japanese couloir, there's a mixed pitch, which personally I think is the technical crux of the whole route. It's roughly M4 or M5. It's nothing extreme, but it's real climbing. And after that little mixed crux, then you have the knife edge ridge, which can vary a lot in conditions, but it's a long section of kind of narrow snow ridge, which often has big cornices on it, but not always. And from there you get to the hanging glacier, which at certain periods in time had a really difficult kind of crevasse ice wall that had to be surmounted on it, and at other periods of time hasn't had that. And then above the hanging glacier, you have what is referred to as the first rock band, the second rock band, and then the third rock band, which is skirted around on the right-hand side. And then above the rock bands, you're basically done with the technical climbing. And I wouldn't say that it's walking from there to the summit ridge, because there's lots of places where it's like 45 degrees and you do like step on rocks here and there. But basically it's like walking or scrambling from there to the summit ridge. But it's a long ways, and usually there's a lot of hard trail breaking to do on the upper part of the Cassin Ridge. So even though it's not technical anymore, often that is the hardest part of the route in terms of how it actually feels.
Although the Cassin has become a test piece for all-around mountaineers that want to maybe bring their skills to the next level, it's also a testing ground for solo climbers. We've talked about the bar-setting ascents of Charlie Porter and Mug Stump back in the day, but like the speed records in Yosemite, the bar continues to be inched higher on the Cassin. This culminated in Colin Haley's 2018 record-breaking speed solo, which clocked in at 8 hours and 7 minutes. Here's Shantel.
I actually remember seeing Colin on the Upper Cassin. My friend Ann Gilbert and I had just climbed the Slovak Direct, and we were on the Upper Cassin, and Colin passed us, and it sort of seemed like he was just on a walk in the park.
Colin actually has a long history of soloing the Cassin, as well as other big Alaska Range routes. One might think this is dangerous, and Colin would probably be the first to admit that he's had a few close calls on these adventures. But surprisingly, one of Colin's closest calls on the Cassin came in 2011 when he was climbing with a partner.
The most memorable moment I've had on the Cassin by a very large margin was in 2011 with a Norwegian friend, Niels Nielsen, when we went to try to do a speed climb of it. And it was my most memorable moment on the Cassin by far, but not for a good reason. We had very bad weather that year, and we finally decided to give it a shot in kind of the one little bit of clear weather that we got, even though we doubted the conditions were going to be very good. And in fact, the conditions were really, really bad. We had very deep trail breaking from 14 Camp to the base of the Japanese couloir, and very deep trail breaking up the whole route. And when we finally threw in the towel above the second rock band, it's because at the end of the second rock band, my friend Niels was maybe like 50 meters ahead of me or something like that, breaking trail. And we were on like must have been 45-degree snow slope. And he was like, hey, the snow feels a little bit weird here. Maybe we should think about this. And I think he literally took one more step and a wind slab fractured like right where he was and fell straight on top of me. And it really wasn't that big of a slab at all. But because it was falling straight into me and hitting me straight into the chest, I was kind of like trying for a few seconds to hold on and not get knocked off. But I did get knocked off. And I mean, it's a totally insane story. I really don't know exactly how I managed not to fall to my death, but I basically got pushed backwards off this 45-degree slope, and I somehow managed to do a 180 at the same time, and I stopped myself just on the two rearmost points on each crampon, facing outwards on this like 45-degree slope of neve as like the wind slab kept sliding by. So it's like one of the most close calls I've ever had. And yeah, we were obviously like super freaked out by that. And then we bailed doing a traverse across the upper southwest face back to the 14 camp. But that was my most memorable experience by far, but not in a good way.
We've talked a lot about how the Cassin is a seminal route where milestones and benchmarks are measured. And another milestone came in June 2021 when North American alpinist Shantel Stora made the first female solo of the Cassin, which she did in an impressive 14 hours and 39 minutes. This was a vision that had begun a few years earlier on the big walls of Yosemite Valley.
I was rather inspired by the idea of soloing routes, and I got started in Yosemite with it, and I kind of had this focus of trying to solo the nose on El Cap in a day. And I almost pulled that off in 2014 and just soloed it in just over 24 hours, and then went back a few weeks later and tried again and ended up soloing it in just over 25 hours. And then kind of had the realization that I had sort of gotten what I was seeking, that experience, and that just trying to do it in a half hour less was seeking something different than what I ultimately wanted or needed. But by doing that, I just kind of realized like my potential, and that I could take that style of climbing and do it in the bigger mountains. And I really wanted to try something.
In 2015, Shantel climbed another hard route on the South Face when she and her partner Jewel Lund made the first all-female ascent of the Denali Diamond. It was during this experience that she really considered soloing the Cassin, but she had some concerns.
My biggest fear with soloing the Cassin was getting to the base of it. I had like no doubts in my mind that climbing the Cassin was, like I just was like, that is going to work out fine for me, but I wasn't sure about approaching because of crevasses. And I hemmed and hawed over my approach forever, which is ultimately why I ended up going with skis. But I also thought it would be amazing to be able to ski to the base of the Cassin, climb the Cassin with my skis on my back and in ski boots, and then be able to ski off Denali. And it just it seemed like the perfect route for it, to be able to link all those things up that I love to do. That was my plan from when I started thinking about this back in 2015. So I ended up skiing down the Seattle ramp, or the 1972 ramp, off the West Rib, which ultimately everything went quite okay doing that. I waited till the heat of the day, which has its own risks in regards to falling in crevasses, but I also knew that the ski conditions would be good. So I did make it to the base of the Cassin without falling into any crevasses. I waited till early morning, about 4 a.m. or 5 a.m., I can't remember what time, to start climbing the Japanese couloir, which is basically the entrance to the Cassin Ridge, and I forget how long it is, but it's a lot of calf-burning ice with a couple steep steps that are maybe like 10 to 20 feet long in them. And Some of it's kind of miserable climbing because I had all firm ice, very hard ice, and so it was just like calf burning. But then once you get up into the bulk of the couloir where it gets steeper, I found it to be just really fun ice climbing in good conditions. I was surprised by the amount of old fixed ropes and stuff melted into the black ice that I'd never heard about, but and then once you get to the top of the couloir, you kind of exit onto this little bit of ridge, and then you end up getting to the base of what's considered the crux pitch of the Cassin, which I did not think was the crux pitch, but it's called like Cassin Ledge pitch, I believe. In the guidebook, maybe they rate it like 5.8 or 5.9, I don't remember, but it's sort of like a chimney. I was also kind of concerned about climbing it with skis because I wasn't sure if my skis would affect the movement in this chimney, but I ended up feeling super secure in this chimney. I also didn't take any gear, like I didn't climb with a rope or anything. I just was climbing it fully solo, free solo, as they call it. Anyway, I found that crux pitch to be quite fun and quite straightforward. And then fortunately, when you get up above that, you end up on this hanging glacier, and it can be a lot of deep trail breaking. There was already a track put in by some friends who had climbed it a few days before, and that made the going quite straightforward, and I was able to save energy. And there's also this feature called the cowboy arête, which is like a very distinctive arête. At this time, it was all deep snow. I think it can oftentimes be blue ice and quite different. Yeah, and then you get up to the first rock band, and that's just, I kind of think like the first and second rock band are a bit more blue collar climbing. And when I say that, I don't mean it how I would normally say blue collar climbing, and that it can be like pretty bad quality rock. This is all really good quality rock. It's all granite. It's solid, but it's just kind of like, you might climb like a difficult move and then move for a while and then climb another like more difficult move, and it's very inconsistent. And after the first rock band, you have another band of snow, and then you get to the second rock band, which is, if my memory serves me right, I believe where I thought the most difficult climbing was. Never, like, it was always well within my ability, but I was sort of just surprised by some of it because I didn't expect it. I thought it would be like all very straightforward. But I remember making a couple moves that I was like, wow, that was pretty tricky. And then at the top, which after the fact, I've talked to a couple people that maybe made the same mistake, but I didn't make the best route finding decisions, and I ended up on some slab, which I found a couple moves of it to be kind of insecure, and I wasn't really happy about being there, but I was there, so I just kind of had to commit to it and move forward. And then after that, it's the long snow slog up the south side and then to the Cassin Ridge proper and to the summit.
For all the talk we've done in this episode about the Cassin being a testing ground for elite alpinists, it's also a proving ground for everyday climbers, probably like a lot of you listening to this podcast. I mean, we all have lives, jobs, relationships, maybe kids. Life is busy, but that doesn't mean we can't have some adventure. And the Cassin might be the perfect stepping stone route for an alpinist, maybe wanting to mix a bit of altitude and cold temperatures with consistent and varied hard climbing. This was certainly the case for Nick Sweeney back in 2022 when he realized a dream that had begun about 10 years earlier.
Yeah, 10-year dream for me. I set it as a goal when I was in a mountaineering class through my university. That must have been in early 2015. And I, at the time I was like sport climbing 5'8", like very green climber. I don't know if I'd ever led a trad pitch, like baby climber. And at the end of my mountaineering course, the instructor asked us all to write down a goal and share it with the team. And, most people had goals of climbing, Mount Rainier or things that are, on everyone's list. I mean, Rainier was on my list too, but I said, even at that point, I was like, I want to climb the Cassin Ridge on Denali by the time I'm 40. And he was like kind of flabbergasted by that. And then he said, well, why wait, until you're 40? What are you, crazy? You can do it sooner than that. And almost exactly 10 years later, I did end up climbing it.
In late May 2022, Nick and 4 of his buddies started their expedition. After acclimatizing on the West Buttress, Nick, alongside his partners Kyle Terry, Noah Kims, and Matt Zavortnik, decided to make a go at the Cassin. On June 3rd, they descended the lower West Rib and made their way up the heavily crevassed northeast fork of the Kahiltna Glacier. They bivvied below the Japanese couloir.
Starting from our bivvy at the base of the Japanese couloir, all the hardest part of the climb, the Cassin Ridge, is focused toward the bottom of the route. The first 1,000 feet of the route is the Japanese couloir. We were hoping it would have been cruiser neve and it would have been super fun and chill, but actually the entire couloir was filled with nothing but dense gray ice. A lot of incredibly hard work. I was climbing with the largest and heaviest backpack that I've ever done any technical climbing in. And so you fire up 1,000 feet of moderate ice climbing, nothing crazy. Cruxes were about WI3. There was a steep crux in the middle. Our friends climbed a WI4 option there. And we actually, Kyle and I, we climbed left and climbed some maybe M4 mixed terrain. But from the top of the Japanese couloir, you actually get onto the crest of the ridge itself. There's kind of a meandering pitch that brings you to what is colloquially known as the crux rock pitch. Goes at about 5'8", pure rock. Really, actually incredible climbing on amazing granite. From the top of that, then you're on the cowboy arete. And through all of my journey to climb the Cassin Ridge, I was always most worried about the cowboy arete because you can learn how to climb 5'8" or WI4 or whatever, but how do you climb a knife edge of sugary snow or bullet hard ice or anything in between? Like, it's so hard to learn to do that kind of stuff. But we got there, conditions were quite good, and the cowboy arete basically shoots up into the sky and carries you to the hanging glacier. That's like the first and really only really great bivvy on the route. There's a perfectly flat spot where the cowboy runs into the glacier, and it was so flat that we were able to fit two-person tents on it and completely unrope and not really walk around, but we didn't feel like we were going to fall off the mountain for a brief time. From the hanging glacier, or from that bivvy, head up the hanging glacier. There's a bergschrund in the middle of the hanging glacier for us, which involved slightly overhung to vertical climbing for 10 meters, something like that. Once you get on top of that bergschrund, finish climbing up the glacier. And I should mention the whole glacier for us was very icy. I mean, we were like front pointing a lot of that. On top of the hanging glacier, cross another bergschrund and you're into the first rock band, which is stacked pitches of moderate granite mixed climbing. I mean, some of the most spectacular glowing golden granite you've ever seen. And everywhere you look, there's little rivers of ice flowing down the mountain. Anytime you wanted protection, there was a crack nearby or good ice to put a screw in. Just immaculate climbing in that section. On top of there, you kind of get into some nondescript kind of snowy terrain that runs into almost a knife edge of snow that carries you to the second rock band. You get into there, and the second rock band is a little bit less rocky, I would say, than the first. You pop into a steep ice couloir, climb that up for a pitch or two, and then there's a pretty sustained, maybe 5'8" mixed pitch that goes up a dihedral. Got on top of that, and then that was the triangle roof bivvy at about 16,500 feet or so. We spent the night there. Really small bivvy. We could only get one tent up, so 2 of our friends had to open bivvy at that ledge. But from the triangle roof, 2 more technical pitches, and you're actually on top of the technical terrain for the whole route in its modern iteration. That's at, I think, 16,700. From there, it's game on. You're full on high altitude mountaineering mode. It's not really hard enough to keep the ropes on for us, or I think for really anybody that climbs this route. But I mean, you wouldn't want to like fall asleep on that section. It's pretty steep still, but 4,000 feet of Good old high altitude mountaineering brings you up snowfields and couloirs and loose rock, and it's never hard, just scrambling, but that brings you up to just about the summit. There's a short traverse to the true summit from the top of that there, and then your only problem is getting off.
All right, well, thanks for hanging out with me today. Hope you enjoyed this episode. A big thanks to John, Shantel, Colin, and Nick for contributing their knowledge to this episode. Really enjoyed talking to all of you and wish you the best in your upcoming adventures. This episode was recorded, written, and produced by me, Evan Phillips, and I curated the music from Artlist. Hey, if you enjoy the Firn Line, make sure and support the show by giving us a review over on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you really love the show, I would encourage you to become a member over on Patreon. You can subscribe at patreon.com/thefernline, or you can find links at thefernline.com. All right, well, take care of yourselves. Peace out. We will catch you soon on the Firn Line.